Well, when did we meet?
We met about 1974, the age of 14, in a youth group, a Jewish youth group thing, which we were both in, and we became friends very quickly and stayed
fairly quickly.
Fairly quickly, I don't want to over-exaggerate this. And we worked on, within this youth group, we used to work on various shows and things like that together, and bits and pieces of presentations, all that sort of stuff. And we kept in contact throughout university. And then I went to America. I was in America from 82 to 86. And when I came back, we said, I was in BBC Radio, and we said, let's try an improv show thing. So we came up with the format and everything together.
We did the first radio show also as a pilot, just a one-off. And the buzz that generated was enormous. It was absolutely fantastic. And partly, I was going to say, was because of the cast.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Dan had assembled the dream cast, which was John Sessions and Stephen Fry. And remember, this is before Stephen was very famous. And Lenny Henry and Dawn French. And I think people forget that. And that was a stellar
just
cast.
went, I've died and gone to heaven. I mean, you know, and I also thought, oh, this is easy. And then we could never get them back on again. We've tried and tried to get Dawn and Lenny back on, and they wouldn't do it. But they were great in the pilot, and they were really, really good. And actually, the pilot, we could have cut 2 shows out of that, I think. I mean, the radio thing was
I can't believe you're still thinking in those terms.
Although, interestingly, I found a piece recently for, our script from the pilot. There were only about 6 games in it. I mean, it was just, very, very few things. I always remember there was a piece after the radio ones where the writer, I'll remember her name in a minute, said there's queues around the block and there's something wonderful and different happening here. And I think that's what helped spark television interest. It's a piece in the Telegraph or Times, and it just said this is really something revolutionary, and people were going nuts for it. And there was this very strange thing that happened where I'd only just got a job in radio. I'd only been there about 18 months, and suddenly Hat-Trick said, we've got an offer to do a pilot for Channel 4, and we thought that's great. And then we said, we've got an offer to do a pilot and 6 shows, and then an offer to do a pilot and 13 shows, and this was all happening, and I was getting a call each day, and I had to sort of call my parents and say, actually, I'm going to leave the BBC, and they were, all their life, they'd wanted me to get into the BBC, and I'd finally got in, and after, really, I mean, I'd done Saturday Night Fry, which was quite successful. This was the first proper hit, and after that one, to go straight off to television with no guarantees past that first show, was nerve-wracking. And the most nerve-wracking thing about it was the regulars on the radio one were John Sessions and Stephen Fry. And we had good extra people in it, but those were really the people that made it, definitely. And so it went to television, and it was going to be Clive in the chair and Stephen Fry and John Sessions, and that was going to be. And we went to America to start auditioning people. And while I was there, we got a call saying Stephen's not going to do it. I was thinking, oh God, what's that going to do? I've left my job at the BBC and we're going there, and Steve's like, he's not going to do it. And then we got another call saying, oh, John's now not going to do it. And that was a terribly sort of frightening moment of going, well, without those two, the show just falls apart. We haven't got anything without them, and I can't believe Channel 4 will take it without them. So when we got back, we went out for dinner with John and Stephen was very good, because he said to John, look, I'm not going to do it, it's not my thing, I'm petrified doing it, but John, it is your thing, you're great at this. And he said, if it makes any difference, John, if you weren't doing it, I would still do it. Don't pull out because I'm not doing it anymore. And he talked John into doing it. And of course, without John, I think it wouldn't have worked. I mean, I think it progressed and moved into a different direction after a couple of series. But certainly for the first couple of series, John was the person that everybody talked to.
He was so exciting, wasn't he? He was erudite and sort of intelligent. And he used to do pastiches of authors, and you felt the author was speaking, Hemingway and Jane Austen. I mean, anybody he would do.
D.H. Lawrence he did on radio, which was absolutely great. And I think he did it again on TV. No, John was brilliant. And it's actually, interestingly, for the stuff Mark and I did together, I think it was the only time we've ever had really brilliant reviews was because we had John and Stephen doing this very clever, erudite stuff, and all the reviewers loved all that. So that's marvellous. When it went a bit more populist, I think the reviews were less positive.
Yes. Although I think you remember when we went to the States, we had fantastic reviews in America as well.
Yes, that's
and
true.
other things in my life I've had great reviews for.
Yeah,
so
Just, working with me,
you, I guess.
Yeah. People have asked us why we chose Clive as the host. I mean, there was a show called The Cabaret Upstairs, and Clive was the compere of it. And in between the acts, so it was basically stand-ups. he would interview people in the audience. And that was as funny as the stand-up stuff. He was just great interviewing people in the audience. He'd remember a bit of information from this guy and use it back later then. He was very, very quick. And when we were doing Whose Line and we realized that we needed to take a lot of stuff from the audience, we thought rather than making that just functional, let's make that actually a positive, interesting part of the show. And so although Clive was actually not that experienced, and he certainly hadn't done any television, we realized that if we had him doing it, that would be a great part. And it was, and he was very quick with the audience, and when he went out and we'd get stuff for the musicals, he'd chat with them. That was 30 seconds, which was quite funny in itself. It wasn't just something that we had to do.
And if you look at Clive in the early shows, it's a kind of fun game to play. You can see how nervous he is, and you can see he's sweating.
I mean, the pilot. I mean, Clive actually, we did put a little piece at the beginning of the pilot where Clive said, and you'll see my very nervous brother hosting this thing. But it was extraordinary because we'd done 6 on radio and he was very comfortable doing that and excellent. And then on the pilot, I mean, he's just sitting there and he's sweating and his knuckles are white. And, as we all know, Clive got very good at doing it, very comfortable, but it does take people time. But that one, it was just extraordinary seeing it. I mean, there was such a tension there. Funny enough, the pilot's quite interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, because of the set, which my tactful friend...
They designed this. I was only working part-time at this point. I was my full-time job. I worked for local authorities. I was oddly enough as a housing officer. I used to run the housing policy unit at the London Borough of Waltham Forest, and I only ever did this as a hobby with Dan. So he'd designed the set, or arranged for a designer to design the set for the pilot, and invited me to come and have a look at it. And it was like an airport terminal, this set. It was supposed to be like a sort of give the sense that it was a late night edgy comedy show, sort of a bit sort of, theatre and dangerous and improvised. And it was blue and it was bright and it was glaring light.
And all of this is fair enough. There's no problem with all of this, but Mark did say it looks like an airport terminal standing right next to the designer. Which was an awkward and difficult moment. But you'll see that after the pilot, we went back to made it red and simplified it. And there was this, and red and black. But it's interesting, the early shows, when we look back at them, they're so dark. And it was partly because there wasn't a lot of set to put light on. And over the years, you'll see we added more and more gauze, so you could put blue light onto it. And by, series 7, 8, 9, 10, it is much lighter. But the early days, I think there's some wonderful stuff in it, but it is so dark, and we're going, what was their sort of budget on how much electricity we could use or something? It's incredibly shadowy and whatever. But it was, I think at the time, it was quite unusual to have something which was that minimalist. I mean, we know there was Have I Got News, and they think it's all over in Buzzcocks, but we were the first of those really to do it, except for other kinds of similar shows which were very BBC One or ITV, which were very glitzy. And to have this sort of antidote to those shows, to have something where there was very little set, very little production values, just quite a dark sort of thing, I think was very interesting. And funny enough, that a lot of people only watched the first few series because they'd always come up and say, oh, I love that show, it's so minimalist. I mean, there was nothing there, it was just black. And it was like that for the first couple of series, but gradually we did start putting more and more set and light and stuff in. On the radio, everyone used to say, oh, was it weird then taking it to television? But to be honest, it was weird taking it to radio because my experience of it was on stage. So you take something to radio, it means you immediately couldn't do anything visual. You couldn't do props, you couldn't do the film dub, and a lot of the comedy is visual. So it had to be of its nature very verbal. When we went to, if you look at the pilot, there's a game we play called Party Quirks. And in that one, you can see the stage origins of it because John Glover, who is guessing the thing, say, all right, John, you go off. This is what we did on stage. So he disappears. And then we say to the other three, right, you're going to be a pirate, you're going to be an airline pilot, you're going to be something else. And then he comes back on. And it's very un-TV. It's sort of, we're just doing what we did on stage. And we realised, once we got that going for the first show, that the way around that was to give people envelopes and put it up on the screen so the person didn't have to walk off the set and not hear something, which is a very, very theatrical device. And actually, the other thing, if you notice about the pilot, is it's the only show where they don't read the credits on the British shows. And that was because we did it in radio, In radio, at the end of a show, somebody will say, and that was Whose Line Is It Anyway, starring Stephen Fry and John Sessions, the producer was Dan Patterson, blah, 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 and they'll do that. And we thought, then when we were there, we had an announcer doing that, and Stephen, I think it was, said, oh God, it just seems so dull at the end of this show, why don't we get one of us to do it? And then we said, well, let's do it as a prize and give you a style to do it in, and that came out of that.
And the rest, they say,
is boring.
Yeah.
Well, and then, when we did the first show on TV, we said, well, you can't read the credits on TV. It just seems ridiculous. So we gave the pilot in without that. And Seamus Cassidy said, well, what happened to the thing where they were reading the credits? And we said, oh, you want that, do you? So that was fine. Then when we went to America and did the America series, they said, oh, you can't possibly have them read the credits. That was just right. You can't do that. And we said, well, it's always a great way to, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. So we did the whole series without reading the credits. And then they came to us and said, we feel it's such a shame they're not doing something at the end because people will switch off. Is there something you could do? And we said, well, no, we've recorded it all now, and you told us not to. So if you look at the America series, from the second series onwards, we did do the reading of the credits again, but that was only after enormous fun.
One of the interesting facts about the radio show, for connoisseurs out there, is that I used to sit next to Clive Anderson at the desk. And one of the great losses, I always thought, when it transferred to television, was that I was moved away from Clive at the desk and shoved in a back room somewhere.
Yeah, there was
locked
a lot
in
of
a cupboard.
Thought that went into that, and decided that Mark was probably better not on stage. But that he used to score it. Mark, radio tradition, we did kind of score it. So Mark was sitting there, and he was on headphones to me, and he'd score it, and Clive would then look at what Mark had done and said, the winner is so and so. And actually, when Clive is on the shows himself and he's writing, he did in a way kind of try and say who had won.
But probably not as well as I did.
Not as well as you did. And it got very surreal with Clive. I mean, it was this thing of saying you've got 1 million points, you've got one. But there was an interesting thing with Clive, which was he could sort of get away with it, but I think it helped the whole show was whenever they tried to do improv shows before that, they didn't have it as a host and performers like a game show, a quasi-game show thing. It was just a troupe. So they would come on and say, okay, can we have something from the audience, shout something out, okay, we're going to do this as Shakespeare, okay, here we go. There was just a little element of smugness about it, which I think you don't get in the theatre because you're there as part of the audience. But when you're watching it on television, I think you do, it just feels a little bit smug, I think is the right word, even though it's not deliberately like that. And I think by having Clive put it on them, they became the victims. So it was like this thing of Clive would be, in a way, being slightly mean to them, and you felt a sympathy with them, and it's like, wow, how are they going to do this? Because we put this on them rather than, okay, we're going to show you how great we are. There was the Clive playing sort of Mr. Nasty, and then they'd do it, and Clive would always say, that was the worst example of that I've ever seen. I'm giving you no points. So his slightly undercutting of it, I think, helped that edge. I think it helped sympathise with the performers. And I mean, it was all genuinely improvised. The question we get asked most, and we always have done, is was it genuinely improvised? And we used to say, you've got an audience member sitting in Clive's shot. You can see, we'd always keep those in. If somebody shouted out and he's sitting just there, we would keep that. Or occasionally we got a shot of the person shouting it out, and they would always say, I can't believe it's improvised, it's too good. And occasionally some of the performers would say, oh, I'm getting all these things saying it's too good, why don't you keep in the bits that are bad? And occasionally when it was a show that wasn't very good, we did keep in the bits that were bad. And everyone would say, oh, that wasn't a very good show. I mean, it was this catch-22 that if it was good enough to be really wonderful and entertaining, people thought it was too good to be improvised. But the truth was, it was 100% improvised.
We used to just take it as a compliment. If the public was saying, oh, surely that's not improvised, then I think that was absolutely down to the performers being fantastic.
And we used to really go out of our way to make sure that they hadn't seen the props, that they didn't know the stuff. We would rehearse it in the afternoon, so we'd get the cameras into position, but it was always giving them different stuff to what they would get that night. So they'd know they were playing film and theatre styles, or they know they were playing World's Worst, but we'd give them a different one to do in the afternoon, so that you really got the spontaneity and the danger in the evening. And it worked, because I think there might have been once or twice when something inadvertently was repeated, and it just was never as good the second time. It was always better if you really got their initial reaction to it. So we went out of our way to make sure that it was genuinely improvised.
If you look at the very early shows, the suggestions that they were given from us, sort of from the show itself, were very simple, very plain.
Like a pirate. There's one by Jonathan Pryce, I think, is just a pirate.
That's all he was. Yeah, it was in Party Quirks.
Yeah, and later on, we started realizing, well, something happens. If you watch an improv show in the theatre, it's a different audience every night. So if they come in and shout out porn film, it doesn't matter because that audience hasn't seen porn film. But on TV, you have to assume that everybody is watching all the shows, which in certain cases is not a correct assumption, but let's assume they're all watching all the shows. It does mean that you've got to have different suggestions. You can't do porn film because we've done porn film. I mean, even so, Ingmar Bergman and Nativity and amateur productions came up a lot. But you had to assume that you were trying to make it different each time. So as you see the series go on, you know, from series 1 to 10 and even more in the American ones, more and more of the suggestions came from us because we would sit there all week working out suggestions to give them, whereas an audience will just shout out the first thing they think of. And very often they're trying to be funny.
Again, they'd never see them. When you said they came from us, the performers would never know them beforehand.
No, it was still completely improvised. But we, as the show, would start giving. So we would, instead of giving a pirate, would say a pirate with a case of dysentery, or you know, a pirate who only robs idiots, or something like that. That would give it more of a twist and make them interact more than just a pirate. But we did 120 episodes here and another couple of hundred in America. And in that amount of stuff that you're doing, it became harder and harder to do things that they hadn't done before. And also you get audiences come along, like with a rock band, who want their greatest hits. So they're shouting out Nativity because they've seen Tony and Josie do Nativity before, and they think, oh, that's great. So they shout it out because they want to see it again. And it's fine, but you can't keep having the same thing. So it is a difference to the theatre. And the other thing I was going to say, you haven't asked me, but I am going to say, this is the biggest thing, I think, difference between doing it in theatre and doing it on TV, is you can go along to a theatre improv troupe and see them. They may be great and they may be bad. And on a night they're bad, you've paid your 10 quid, you've had your drinks, you're part of the audience, you've had a nice night out, it doesn't matter. On TV, you can't go to the commissioning editor and say, oh, sorry, the show didn't work tonight. We haven't got a show. It always had to work. You've got to have a show at the end of it. So it means that it can't be all right. It means there's all sorts of things that stem from that. You've got to have the best performers. You know, people sometimes say, why didn't you have so-and-so? Why didn't you take more risk? But the truth of the matter is, it only worked with people who were great. You had to make sure that the games you did would work. Because if we did a game that didn't work, that was fine. If you did 2 games that didn't work, everyone would start losing confidence in it. The performers would start losing confidence, so they'd go very sweary or very big or druggy or whatever it was. And so it puts the bar up there, so any clever stuff that anyone comes out afterward doesn't really work. So you always had to make sure that if we had a new game to try, we'd always put it in between 2 games that we knew would work. And there were some episodes, I remember very clearly there was one where we'd done about 8 episodes and Mark said, oh, we got this one in the bag. And for some reason after that, no other game worked. And we used to have this.
That's at least 12 or 15 years.
I know, I've been harbouring that. But there was this sort of cycle.
It wasn't my fault.
No, it's coincidence. It is coincidence. It's jinxing the thing. But there was a cycle of confidence.
No, you just said jinxing it. No, it wasn't my fault.
No, it wasn't. Well, scotch that. But sometimes if they were going really well, it would go like that and spiral up. And if it was going very badly, it would spiral down. And it was very difficult once it was spiraling down to get it back going again. Everybody, and the audience would lose confidence. And we have this rule, which was that on a good night, everything goes well. It's a sort of truism, but it was the case. On a bad night, everything would go badly. So just at the point where you're desperate for a good suggestion to get this game going, somebody in the audience will shout out a crap suggestion, which Clive will then take, give it to them. Or there would be something where they quoted a Beatles lyric, and we can never get Beatles lyric. And so we'd have to stop and say, don't do that. And at which point, Clive and all the performers would then start thinking it was terribly amusing to pick up on this thing that we couldn't use. So you'd have an hour of stuff about Beatles lyrics that we knew we couldn't use. But it was that thing, the show had to work, that was it. And fear, everything was based on fear, that at the beginning of the night you had blank slate, there was nothing, and you had to have something at the end of the night.
Nobody has more to fear than the producer.
I used to look young, look at me now. This is because of Whose Line, the fear of doing all of these shows.
We're both only 28.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, I'm 27.
You wish.
it was very weird on the show because Stephen Fry, as I said, pulled out after the radio ones. And his agent, he has the same agent as Tony, and she called up as Lorraine and said, "Oh, I've got somebody who's just as good." And I was in this thing of, screw this, you're just trying to put somebody else onto us because Stephen's not doing it and we're really, you know, going to struggle. And so we said, all right, well, he can come along and audition. And Tony auditioned and he was great. And he was really good. And he was increasingly the sort of cheeky person on the show and the person that would do, you know, he was naughty. He would do that kind of stuff.
He would push the boundary.
He would push the boundary. And the only thing that I can actually remember Seamus at Channel 4 saying, you cannot have that in the show. Usually we could bleep it. But there was a thing we did, which was the world's worst person to, this was one of those nights when it wasn't going well, actually. It was the world's worst person to be at a funeral, or the world's worst thing to say at a funeral. Oh, yeah. And Tony just leapt onto the floor where the coffin would be, or the thing, and started sort of humping away and said, "I can't resist a stiff." Tony used to give us that stuff, and he was wonderful. The camera loved Tony. He
was very telegenic.
He just grabbed the camera and looked straight down.
Yeah. He had energy. He was very intelligent, very bright.
Yeah.
He could sing. He had a very good voice.
And also, you also notice on the hoedowns, as the series as we go from one to the other, who is in that last spot. The two difficult spots were the first spot,
because there's no time.
Because there's no time for them to think of anything. And that was usually Josie, Mike, and in the American one, Greg often did that, and Brad. Yeah. It was people who were very good.
Well, Chip. Quite a few of the English.
Yeah, and Chip
British
did
series.
And then the end one, you had to have somebody who you knew was going to give you a really funny one, because there was also a rule we had in that game, in Let's Make a Date, in all sorts of games, where if the last thing wasn't funny, it felt like the whole game hadn't worked. So you had to make sure the person in that slot would give you something. And Tony, you see, it was not in the first couple of series, but certainly as we went along, started taking over that position, because you knew, and if he wasn't there, he'd be in the third position, he'd give you something very funny. And as Mark says, sort of on the edge of being broadcastable or not. And a lot of people, I think, went for him afterwards. We got this, there was a weird thing. I mean, I think for the whole show, there were people who were slightly anti it, but people, I think, suddenly started having a go at Tony. And we were always amazed because we thought he was brilliant. And also, I have to say, Tony was one of the nicest people we ever worked with. I mean, he was just a lovely person who was really, really talented. Well, Josie wasn't in the radio series because we had never seen the Comedy Store players before. And so we did the whole radio series, and then somebody said...
We auditioned her, didn't we?
Not till after. No. What happened was they wouldn't audition.
I think she came along to the Donmar, did she not?
That was after the radio series.
Oh, that's what I mean, yeah. We auditioned her for the TV
Well,
series.
because on the TV thing, somebody said there's Josie and Paul in particular, and Sandy from the Comedy Store, you should have a look at them. And they weren't particularly thrilled about auditioning, but we had this thing that we wanted to see somebody do our stuff, not just their stuff. So Paul and Josie came along, and I remember in that particular audition, they just blew everybody else away. So immediately said, well, we've got to have them on. And I think Josie was in the pilot and in the first show. And I would say Josie and Sandy were fantastic.
And the other great thing about them, and indeed Paul and Tony, is that they're all different. They all complemented each other. They all brought something else to the party.
And I was always incredibly impressed by people who could do the music, because, you know, when people said it's not improvised, and I'd say it would be, I could sort of see, you know, with a scene, you can see the skills and stuff they're using for that, or the one-liners. But how they managed to come up with a tune and words off the cuff, and they were absolutely off the cuff. You know, I always thought that was amazing, and Josie was great. And then when we got Mike McShane onto the show, and Josie and Mike together doing those things, it was wonderful.
Josie had a great rhyme once. She was doing a toaster.
Oh yeah.
And I think it was a soul song or a Motown, and she managed to rhyme filament with element, which was brilliant.
It was brilliant. She was, Josie was great, and I can still remember some of the songs she did, because I thought the tune she came up with was so good. You could have almost put out a record of some of the stuff that she did. And you know,
and then Mike came along.
Well, Mike was interesting, because Mark, myself, and somebody else were in America doing these auditions very early on. It was for Series 2. No, it was Series 1, because he was in Series 1. And we were in San Francisco, and because we had to get a flight out that afternoon, we did the audition about 10 in the morning, which is not a good time to audition performers. And we were waiting around, and suddenly this huge sort of...
We were in a theatre. No, we'd already started.
We'd started, this huge guy came from the back, and I thought it was the janitor. No disrespect to Mike.
He had a burger. He was eating
a burger, and he was unshaven. He had a sort of T-shirt that ended there, and his stomach was coming out. And I just went, oh, God, who is this?
And he insisted on having a go. We said, all right, go on, up you go. And gave him, the first thing we gave him was Shakespeare.
And wow, straight out.
And the Americans can never do Shakespeare.
And he was great. And then we gave him Star Wars. And it was always a thing that people, whenever we gave them Star Wars in film and theatre styles, they'd always sort of get out the lightsaber and say, he just became a sort of Jabba the Hutt kind of thing, some weird thing, you know, talking in some... we've just went, this is...
probably predated Jabba.
Maybe it was predated, but it was just everything we gave him, he was wonderful. And I remember on the flight home, me and Mark talking, and I said, can we put him on? Because at that time it was John Sessions and Paul. It was very
It was much
clever.
more genteel.
It was genteel and clever and wordplay and gag.
And I think I said, yes, we must put him on.
I think Mark did say that. And we got him on, and he did number 9 of the first series. And actually, he was so good that he was the mainstay of the compilation. There's a wonderful thing, which we didn't put in number 9, which I've always regretted. It goes in the compilation where they did a hang gliding musical. And his line was, if I had to go down, I'd go down with you. And the audience, it was just brilliant. Him and Josie, I mean, that's when they really started clicking.
But then he became a mainstay of the show.
Well, in the second series, we got him over to do 2 shows, I think. And then each week we said, no, stay on. You've got to stay on. And he stayed for the rest of the run. I think you noticed that he comes in at about show 6 and he's on the rest of them. We're just going, what we were very lucky with, I think, was finding these people who were just fantastic.
Although, to be fair, although I can brag about Mike, maybe we should mention 1 or 2 people we also auditioned and turned down. Yeah. Nobody will know about this.
We turned down. Well, Mark wasn't... Were you at the New York audition?
I was instrumental in turning... I bare my soul here. We auditioned Mike Myers. And he was kind of okay. To be fair, he was just okay.
Well, he was ill on the day.
Away.
Mike Myers had a terrible cold. Came in. We knew him a bit because he'd been in a group called Malarkey Myers, and he'd done stuff. And we'd never really seen him. And on the day, he was sort of fine, but he said he was very sick. But at the time, in our mind, the Americans we had were Mike McShane, Ryan Stile.
And Greg had done it by then.
Greg. And Mike was just sort of fine. And of course, you see all the work he's done since, and he's a complete comic genius. And we were just going, that was a terrible person to turn down. We turned down others, didn't we?
I'm sure we did. Sad but true.
We did. I'll tell you another one.
Steve Martin.
I'll tell you who we did turn down was Steve Carell. Now, Steve Carell was in Second City, and I'd always seen him in sketch shows and thought he was just brilliant in sketch shows. I mean, I pitched over the years a couple of sketch shows in America, and he was always sort of the #1 name on it because he was this wonderful thing of being completely grounded but very unexpected as well. And I thought, but when we auditioned him for improv, he was good, but he wasn't as good at improv as Ryan or Mike or Colin or Greg, so we didn't take him. And of course now, Steve Carell, again a comic genius, is sort of the #1 name on any comedy film.
He's in the American Office, the American version of The Office.
And he was in
Anchorman
and Bruce Almighty and all sorts of... He's wonderful. So we have our list of people we didn't get. But it was also...
We had some interesting people, though. Because we had, amongst others, we had Jonathan Pryce, who I think people wouldn't normally associate with doing this sort of stuff.
And Jonathan was very good. There was a great bit in one thing where him and John Sessions were doing a film and theatre style thing together. And John was... very confident, and everything that came up, restoration comedy, John would take it off, and Jonathan Pryce just couldn't get a word in edgeways. And in the end, they did a thing, and Jonathan Pryce said, if I'd have known the part was this small, I wouldn't have taken it, which was great. Jonathan was, most of the time, the people who worked on the show who were really good were people who did it all the time. That was their #1 string, the #1 string to their bow. But 1 or 2 people, Jonathan Pryce was on, Griff Rhys-Jones did a couple, and Griff was very good as well.
Griff, I think, is worth remembering because he once ate his sock.
I think he ate John Sessions' sock.
John Sessions' sock.
John Sessions, they were doing Chaplin in film and theatre style.
That really should be on the 100 best TV moments. I don't know why it isn't.
I know, it's Chaplin, and they, this famous scene where he eats the shoe. So John took off his sock and started eating it, and then he gave it over to Griff. I think it might have been Griff's sock, but I think it was John's sock. And Griff ate it. I mean, he's a trooper, he went with it. Griff was very good because Griff is very intelligent, very quick, and can act. And it's always great when we're doing the film and theatre styles, how everybody did it differently. Like Tony would sort of undercut it. Paul would do a version of it, but slightly stand outside it. John tended to just do this sort of individual pastiche, but Griff became that person and was quite good at doing that. I mean, Paul...
I was going to say Paul.
Well, Paul was interesting because, you know, we all know now Paul from Have I Got News for You, and he's absolutely brilliant. And I think Paul is in the top 10, top 20 great British comedians of all time. I mean, in all the British shows, I think he was the person that could make me laugh the most, particularly him and Tony. And he would also give them such a hard time. I remember there was a thing once with Tony, Josie did a thing where they said Oscar Wilde and she did something. He said, oh, that's very Oscar Wilde, that is, very Oscar Wilde. And a thing with Tony where...
That was the same show, I think that was the same show where he was Sponge Man.
He was, well, that's on the tape. That's the one that won the BAFTA. I think it's number 13 from the second series. And there was a musical, and we always thought, how can you put Paul in the musical? Because he can't really sing.
So we put him on last.
We put him on last, and they'd all come up with a thing, and Tony came up with a thing and said, there's a certain man who does this thing, and he's got an enormous sponge. And then Paul came in as the Sponge Man, and they all turned it into this sort of Jesus Christ superstar kind of thing.
And all he had to do was say, Sponge Man!
And it was great, and that was the one that won us the BAFTA. But he also did a thing with Tony once where Tony, I think, had conjured in a mime sort of thing, but in a scene, an iron or something, I can't remember. And Paul said, you can't do that. I wasn't there. And he said, oh, what have oh, there's my helicopter. Oh, sorry, I'm in prison. Yeah. And, you know, he was always and he had Tony in hysterics.
I was going to say, that was also a difference between Whose Line and some of the theatre improvisation, where the theatre improvisation, the people doing it were often very purist about it.
Yeah.
And sort of, you could never cross what somebody had said, you could never deny something. And we said, do whatever you like, as long as it's funny.
Yeah, we didn't have a baggage.
Always had that attitude, didn't he?
Yeah, Paul, absolutely. And there was one group we'd gone to see, and they were okay, but they weren't that great. And there was one really funny person in it. And we went up to the person afterwards who ran the group and said, what's his name? And she said, oh, him, oh, he's a bit gaggy, isn't he? It was like, well, that's what we want. We want gags.
Hooray.
I mean, it's funny, there are these rules of improv, and a lot of them are very important, and they make the thing work. But a lot of them are just common sense, you know, that don't negate. Well, if you negate all the time, it means you're not going to get a scene that nothing can build. And that was that episode I was telling you about where there was Sandy, Rory and Paul. They were all doing that, and so we weren't building anything. But you can negate occasionally because it's hilarious if you do. You just don't want to do it all the time. Same with swearing. If you swear all the time, it doesn't work because everybody's expecting that and you just get desensitized. But if you do it once in the show to great effect, it's wonderful. So we used to say, look, there are these rules, and we'd have tips for people, and most of the people on it anyway were very, very good. But we said, you know, if you want to go down that route, that's fine. You know, anything that will make it as funny as possible.
I think we should mention Ryan, because Ryan Stiles was, and always was, fantastic on the show.
He was fantastic.
He was just...
But what we hadn't realised in the early days was that we didn't realise how important it was for people to be with people they improvise with a lot. And Ryan came over and did a show on his own. He was really good, but it was only when we started putting him with Colin that we got this real magic, because they have a telepathy, they worked. It was like Sweeney and Steen. They were good individually, but when they came together, they were very good. And the same with Ryan and Colin, was they were so used to working with each other and doing stuff that we realised suddenly that you had to have them together to do it. And Colin did 2 or 3 shows on his own, and wasn't that great.
When we saw him originally, Colin was one of the funniest people I think we'd seen on stage. We saw him in Toronto, didn't we? And he really was hilarious, and he could do scenes like nobody else. And then we brought him over to Britain, and Colin's very shy, and he found it very difficult at first, didn't he?
Yeah.
And I think other people were probably saying, why are you keeping him on? But we were just waiting for the magic to happen.
And it happened really when we put him with Ryan. But Colin always says that he came over and I said, you know, there's something like, make sure your flight isn't till Monday or something like this, you know, in the idea that you may get another show. And he did his show and then didn't hear anything, so just flew off again. And he's always said, oh, I guess I didn't really do that well. I'll tell you something else we should mention is Richard, by the way, because Richard was the musician on all the shows. And in America, it basically took 3 people to replace him, because he could do the piano, he could do the guitar.
He'd play anything. He'd play the flute. If we were doing a kind of a folk song, he'd do a little flute
or recorder thing. I mean, he was brilliant from that point of view. And I think he got a bit fed up with it saying, you know, and on the piano Richard Branch, because he's an improviser himself, but we always only used him to do the music, but he was great. And again, because he'd worked a lot with Josie and then as we did the show a lot Mike, he was great at sort of feeling where they were going and getting towards an ending. And, you know, he also was somebody that you could say any style and he could do a pastiche of any style, and that was incredibly useful to us. And it also meant that's why music became such a big part of the show, was because we had people who were great at doing that, and it did lift it. You know, people said we were quite ruthless. You know, people would come on and we just wouldn't use them again, but it was this fear. It was just that there was this thing of you can't have somebody and they're just okay for a long time and never do it. The one exception was Colin, because he took a time to warm up, but we knew that he was just brilliant, and we thought if we can get his... I'll tell you the other one that is going to appear on, because it's in the first series, is Peter Cook. Now, Peter Cook was on the show in the afternoon.
Whom I think it's fair to say we discovered.
Yeah, we did, obviously. That was his first big break. And Peter Cook was on the show, and we did the afternoon rehearsal thing, and he was just brilliant. We went, God, you're seeing the years fall off this guy. This is what he was like. He is the genius. And then Rory McGrath said, oh, well, I'm going to take him out for a drink. You know, I'll look after him. And they came back and Peter was just completely smashed. So in the show itself, he just wasn't that great. It was okay, but he's had a lot to drink, and he just wasn't the same at all as he'd been in the afternoon.
Rory said, I'll take him out for a drink to settle his nerves.
Yes, that was right. Great. That's a really helpful thing. Rory, if you're watching, thank you for that. And there's a scene where Peter Cook and Stephen are doing things, and Peter's sort of rambling on, and Stephen just looks at the camera like that. And it's, you know, we all know Peter was a genius, and he was. But on the show, it was, and we didn't use him again because it just was sort of so disappointing, I think. Then. But of the main ones, so there's Paul, Sandy, Tony. No, Sandy was great, and Sandy also hit it off with Mike. So for a while, if you put Sandy and Mike together in film and theatre, they were brilliant because there was a sort of little and large kind of thing.
And again, you had that thing where Mike would weave these intricate scenes with a fantastic dialogue and sort of great language, and then Sandy would cut him to the quick with a sort of line that was just hilarious.
And there was also certain people who were brilliant at doing things like running the party because they'd be very funny. You know, again, you didn't want that. Sometimes we'd put somebody on who was new in that, and it would just became a functional thing. But with Sandy in particular and Paul in particular,
and Tony,
when they ran the party, they were funny at it. So you not only got the comedy of what the other people were, you got the comedy of them interacting with the host. And Paul, I remember there was a great thing where Archie Hahn came over, and Archie was, it was something like a, what's it called, a lover when you spurn them, something...
Cuckolded lover?
Not cuckolded,
dumped?
Kind of like a dumped male lover. It was probably slightly more elegantly phrased, but it was that. So he came on and knocked at the door, and he said, are you going to let me in, or do I have to fourth entry? And Paul just stared at him and went, you better come in then. And he just played that, and it was perfectly done. So you always got that sort of stuff from Paul. Archie was interesting because we brought Archie Hahn over, and Archie was brilliant. He'd been in an improv groups, and he was nearly in the original Saturday Night Live thing, and wasn't because he wanted to stay back to design and theatre.
And for those of you that don't know Archie, if you watch Spinal Tap again, he does have a small role.
Well, I was going to say that he is introduced. You will see it on the beginning of one of the tapes where Clive said, I'm from Spinal Tap, Archie Hahn. And now Archie has this tiny part in it. He plays this very camp
He's a waiter. Yeah, room service.
But everybody thought, because he looks a bit like him, that he was Christopher Guest, because he does look a bit like Christopher Guest. So they thought we had the star of Spinal Tap on the show, but it is actually only a tiny part.